Before. We are very proud to bring you a speaker tonight who really doesn't need much introduction to most of us. She is the Assistant Director of Mount Clemens Public Library, the Historical Research Chairman for the Rochester-Avon Historical Society, the researcher, writer, and chairman for the cemetery walk that we have every year, and the author of a number of books on Rochester and Mount Clemens, including the Remembering Rochester series. And I'm very proud to give you Debbie Larsen.
Thank you, Margaret. It's good to be back here again. Share a little bit more of some of the things that I've found with you. I worked on the Woodward house a while ago, so I gathered some information about the Woodward family, and then about a year and a half ago I was doing a little bit of an inquiry into the Hamlin house, and it just struck me how interesting these two families were when looked at side by side. Although they came to our area independently of one another, there are some pretty interesting parallels in their lives. So I started sketching out a little program, and tonight we're going to visit with two pioneer families in Rochester's history. And if you look at the picture up here, in case you don't know them already, I'll introduce them. On the left is John Fairchild Hamlin. Next to him, his wife Laura Andrews Hamlin. Next to her is Penina Simpson Woodward. And last, her husband, Lysander Woodward. Now, before I get into their stories, let me just quickly set the stage with a timeline. So first of all, in 1817, we have the arrival of the Graham Party in Rochester. As we know, we're going to be celebrating the 200th anniversary of that event in a couple of years. Oakland County was organized the next year in 1818, and at that time, the county was divided into two general townships, north half of the county and the south half of the county. But as the settlement increased and we had greater population, it became clear that with the villages that were beginning to pop up, there was a need for a subdivision of the general townships. So in 1835, Avon Township was set off and organized its own local government. And that is right about the time that our story for the evening picks up. In the immediate area of the village of Rochester, just outside the city limits, we had three large landowners that kind of dominated our landscape. To the immediate north of the village, we had the lands of Lysander Woodward. To the south, the lands of John Fairchild Hamlin. And to the west, the lands of Lyman and Elliot Wilcox. Tonight we're going to look at the Hamlins and the Woodwards because the Wilcoxes are a big story all by themselves. Maybe we can do a program on that some other time. We are talking about pioneer times in Rochester, so no railroad, no stagecoach line, no plank roads even. Just getting to Rochester at all was not that easy. You either followed the rivers inland as the Graham Party had done, or you took a wagon trace north through the more or less wilderness between here and Detroit. And these were not actual roads. They were truly wagon tracks. They weren't maintained by anyone in particular. So it was a multi-day trip, and you had to be prepared for things like broken axles and wagon reaches because that was just part of the experience. And that is the environment into which our two subject families came. The Hamlins were the first to arrive in Avon Township. John Fairchild Hamlin was born in East Bloomfield, New York in 1799. You can see that right there on the map. East Bloomfield is in the Finger Lakes region of western New York State in Ontario County, and it's right along the border with Monroe County. Here's just a little bit about John's family background. His parents were Elijah Hamlin and Lydia Pope. Elijah was a native of Massachusetts, and he was a direct descendant of the first Hamlin to come to America from England. That happened in 1640. Elijah and Lydia moved from Massachusetts to East Bloomfield, New York in 1792, and then 7 years after they settled there, their son John Fairchild Hamlin was born. Family history records that John was affectionately known as Jack by his family and friends, and that his formal name, John Fairchild, was the name of his mother's sister's husband. John Hamlin was the 6th of 11 children born to Elijah and Lydia, and 3 sons and 1 daughter of Elijah and Lydia would eventually wind up in Avon Township. Elijah Hamlin established himself as a successful farmer when he moved to East Bloomfield, but he took up another occupation about 1823. In that year, the construction of the Erie Canal reached the area of what was going to be known as Lockport, New York, and a series of locks needed to be built there, so Elijah Hamlin signed up as a contractor to build the Lockport locks. In 1925, the project was completed, the Erie Canal was opened, and the New York State Canal System now connected the Atlantic Ocean with the Great Lakes. This opened the upper Midwest, including Michigan, to westward migration and settlement in a big way, and as we know from our own local history, Oakland County saw a huge influx of settlers coming from New York State following the opening of the canal. If you look in western New York, you will find Hamlin family footprints all over the state. In Buffalo, you can eat dinner at this house. This is the Cicero J. Hamlin Mansion in Buffalo, New York. Cicero Hamlin was a filthy rich Buffalo businessman. He made a fortune in the sugar processing industry and in racehorse breeding. And this was his home. It is now an American Legion post with a public restaurant and banquet center in it, so you can go and have dinner there. Now, James Hamlin, who was the immigrant from England that was the first one to come to American shores in 1640, had 2 sons named Thomas and Isaac. Our John F. Hamlin of Rochester is descended from Isaac, and that was his great-grandfather, while Cicero, the guy who built this house, is descended from the other brother, Thomas, who was his great-grandfather. So our John Hamlin and Cicero Hamlin of Buffalo were 3rd cousins. Now, Cicero's great-great-grandson is somebody that you may recognize, so I'll show you his picture. Yes, this is I don't know how many cousins, how many times removed from our John Hamlin, but they are cousins and they do share a common ancestor. And here's another interesting connection to our Hamlin family. If we have any keyboard musicians in the room, you may be interested in this. John F. Hamlin's grandfather, Seth Hamlin, had a brother whose grandson was a mechanic and inventor in Buffalo, New York. There's a whole big branch of this family in Buffalo, New York. And so if I read the relationship chart correctly, our John F. Hamlin and this man that I'm talking about, whose name was Emmons Hamlin, were 2nd cousins once removed. Emmons Hamlin worked for the George Prince Melodeon Company in Buffalo, and he invented a way to voice reeds that was far superior to anything that was done at that time. So his technique was used to build the parlor organs and melodeons that his employer built, and it got a lot of attention, particularly with a Boston musician named Henry Mason, who thought that he could do something with this, so he contacted Emmons Hamlin and said, "You got to come to Boston and go into business with me, and we'll get something done." So in 1854, the 2 of them formed this company. And if you've ever played a keyboard, you probably know that Mason and Hamlin is one of the premier makers of fine pianos in the U.S., and they were a direct rival of Steinway. Very prestigious make. Okay, back to our branch of the Hamlin family. John F. Hamlin didn't wait for his dad to finish building the Lockport locks and the canal to be opened. He actually lit out for the territory when he was 21 years old in the company of his older brother Adolphus, his sister Olive, and her husband William Burbank. This group left in the summer of 1820. They traveled down to the southern edge of New York State, where they picked up the Allegheny River and they traveled by flatboat down the Allegheny to the Ohio. And then in Cairo, they picked up the Mississippi and Missouri rivers. They traveled by keelboat to St. Charles, Missouri. They had friends there who invited them to come to St. Charles to live. None of the party liked St. Charles, and it's not recorded what they had against it, but they all left within the year. Adolphus decided to move to Galena, Illinois, and John moved on to Detroit. The Burbanks at first went to Sandusky, Ohio, and then they decided that Olive would go back to New York to visit her family while her husband William would go up to Detroit, meet up with John, and John and William would try to find land for them to settle on. And so that is how John Hamlin and William Burbank ended up in Oakland County, where they established their homesteads in the 1830s. And then Olive came back to join her husband in Avon Township. So John bought land in Section 22, and in 1831 he married Laura Andrews of Macomb County and brought her back to his homestead. 6 children. The first one was born in 1833. John was a farmer, and his money was in sheep. If you've heard Rod's explanation about the economic underpinnings of Oakland County when you do the historical walking tour, you know all about this. The agricultural census of 1850 tells us that John Hamlin had a herd of 404 sheep in that year, which was by far the most of any single farmer in Avon Township. He also had 12 horses, 8 cow, 4 oxen, 23 other cattle, the aforementioned 404 sheep. His land produced 720 bushels of wheat, 160 bushels of corn, and 220 bushels of oats. His money crop was wool. His sheep produced 1,200 pounds of wool. And the cash value of his farm in 1850 was $12,000. I ran this through some of the online converters, and the best guess that the economic status equivalent in today's dollars would make him worth about $5.2 million. Now, John's other economic endeavor was in the area of transportation infrastructure. In 1837, the Clinton-Kalamazoo Canal was started at Mount Clemens, and it was envisioned that it would follow the rivers westward to cut a water transportation route across the southern peninsula of Michigan to connect Lakes Erie and Michigan, just as the Erie Canal had crossed New York and connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic. John Hamlin followed in his father's footsteps. Just as Elijah had worked as a contractor on the Erie Canal, John F. Hamlin worked as a contractor on the Clinton-Kalamazoo Canal. And so did John's brother-in-law, Loren Andrews. Loren was the younger brother of John's wife, Laura, and he worked as a surveyor on the canal route. Loren was a prominent resident of Washington Township in Macomb County, and you probably recognize his house. As we all know, the canal made it only as far as the Rochester area before the whole project went belly up, and John Hamlin, along with a number of other contractors, spent almost the next decade petitioning the state legislature for payment of their just wages and expenses on the project. But in the meantime, he turned his attention to other transportation improvements, that of the plank road and the railroad. On March 12, 1844, the state legislature of Michigan approved PA 86 of 1844 to incorporate the Troy and Rochester Railroad Company. The officers of whom were John F. Hamlin, Seneca Newberry, Almond Mack, Samuel Axford, and a few others. Provided that the necessary capital could be raised by subscription, this railroad was supposed to run south from Rochester until it intersected the Detroit and Pontiac Railroad. The law had a sunset clause 4 years hence, so that if the funds were not raised, the entire thing was over with, and that's exactly what happened. The subscriptions weren't there, and the railroad was not built. If you think about it, a railroad from Rochester to the Detroit and Pontiac was really only a spur. And the only people that would be interested in subscribing to build that would be those living along the spur. And there probably just wasn't enough capital among a bunch of small landowners with maybe 80-acre family farms So this scheme was probably dead on paper from the beginning. But John Hamlin wasn't done with transportation. In 1848, he, along with several other Avon residents, incorporated the Rochester and Royal Oak Plank Road Company. The proprietors had a 60-year franchise to build and operate a plank road between Rochester and Royal Oak along the corridor that we know today as Rochester Road. These roads were maintained by tolls paid at toll houses stationed at various intervals along the routes, similar to the turnpikes that we use today. And the toll house for the Rochester terminus was located on the Hamlin farm. Courtesy of Rod and Susan Wilson's collection, we have a plank road receipt from this toll gate at the Hamlin farm. This is from a middle week of September in 1855, showing the activity at the toll gate. And it is signed by Calvin Hooper Hamlin, who was the collector of tolls, and that's John's brother. You recall I mentioned that 3 of his siblings ended up here. Calvin Hooper Hamlin was one of them. Now, the plank road was an important advance for Rochester and Avon because it provided a semi-reliable transportation route to and from Detroit for a while. The toll road franchise was eventually revoked because the owners were not maintaining the road properly, if you can imagine. Public service was also a part of John Hamlin's life. He was a fairly wealthy landowner, so it would have been incumbent upon him to serve in local government. There just weren't all that many men in a position to do so. John Hamlin served as the supervisor of Avon Township in 1837 and as the Justice of Peace in 1845, and he also took his turn serving as tax collector. At its height, the John Hamlin farm comprised more than half of Section 22 and part of Section 23, 545 acres in all, plus lots in the village of Rochester and some property elsewhere in Oakland County. According to his probate file, when John died in 1863 at the age of 64, the land in his estate was valued at more than $30,000, so he was definitely a multimillionaire in modern terms. His widow, Laura, survived him by 20 years and died in 1883. 4 Hamlin children survived into adulthood, son Adolphus and daughters Carolyn, Belle, and Laura. Adolphus married Mary Ann Hulsizer. The couple had no children, and Adolphus died in 1911. Laura married Dr. Henri G. Idy in 1888. They were divorced in 1918 with no children, and Laura died in 1925. Carolyn married a Troy Township farmer named Enoch Dusenberry, and they had several children. You'll see them listed there. Carolyn died in 1907. And then Belle Hamlin married Marsden Birch. The couple had no natural children, but they did adopt a child named Malcolm Gates, who, so far as I can tell, was probably a relative of Marsden Birch, somewhere a cousin or something like that. Belle was the last of John F. Hamlin's children to be alive. She died in 1936. Marsden Birch was an interesting character. He was born in Seneca County, New York. He came to Michigan to pursue his legal education at U of M. And he was present at the creation of the village of Rochester in 1869, when the village electors voted to incorporate the village and govern it separately from the rest of Avon Township. Marsden Birch served as the first village clerk of Rochester and its first village attorney, and those were his very first jobs in public service. He went on to serve as probate judge of Osceola County, then he was appointed circuit judge in Kent County, then he was appointed assistant U.S. attorney for the Western District of Michigan. And while he was a U.S. attorney, he traveled all over the West and adjudicated a number of important land cases. Then he was appointed special assistant to the Attorney General of the United States and moved to Washington, D.C. to take up his duties there. Belle Hamlin Birch and her husband Marsden Birch were undoubtedly the most well-connected people in Rochester at the turn of the 20th century. I flipped through some of the Washington, D.C. newspapers for that time and found on January 26, 1905, President Teddy Roosevelt was hosting a state reception at the White House. The guest list was published in the paper, and Marsden and Belle Birch and their son Malcolm were listed as having attended the state reception, and that was not the only one that I found their names on. Also at the reception were members of the Supreme Court, the President's Cabinet, and the Diplomatic Corps. So if they were regularly rubbing elbows with presidents and diplomats, I'd say that they undoubtedly had more juice than any other of the residents of Rochester at that time. Now about the Hamlin House, which stands still today at 1812 South Rochester Road. When John's widow, Laura, died in 1883, the Hamlin homestead essentially passed to daughter Belle Hamlin Birch and Laura, who was at the time still unmarried. Laura would soon marry Dr. Eide, and so the care of the farm was handled by the Birches. They were not living in Rochester, but only came back from Grand Rapids or Washington, D.C. for visits, so they had a superintendent running the farm. Around 1900, when they were at that time based in Washington, D.C., they began to be part-year residents of Rochester again. They would live in D.C. during the fall and winter, and then they would return to Rochester in the spring and summer when the heat was oppressive in D.C. and the big mosquitoes were coming off the Potomac. And the newspapers tell us that in 1903, they remodeled and added on to the old Hamlin house. And here's what the story says in the Rochester Era, quoting now. Judge Birch has returned to Washington, D.C. and his duties in the Department of Justice. During the summer, the judge has built over the old Hamlin home, 2 miles south of Rochester, until it is now one of the finest country residences in Avon Township. Always a stately mansion, it has been added to and overhauled until now it is a most desirable home. End quote. We don't know exactly what the John Hamlin house looked like before that renovation because no images of it from that era have surfaced. The earliest view of the house that we have is from about 1915, and this is again courtesy of Rod and Susan Wilson's collection. And this is after the Birch renovation has already taken place. You notice the caption says old home. That's what they called the house. It's frequently referred to as old home in the newspapers. In 1916, the Birches decided to sell off part of the Hamlin farm for a subdivision. Here's one more picture. This is from the 1950s. And of course, you know, today there is a huge addition on the west side of the house, but this is still pretty much the view that you see from Rochester Road. When the Birches decided to sell off part of the farm, they had a number of the farm buildings moved up closer to this house because they were reserving the house and the 42 immediate acres for themselves and selling the rest of the property. The newspaper, again the Rochester Era, ran this story under a banner headline, and it said in part the following, quoting again, "It will be gratifying to the people of this region that Mrs. Birch holds on to the place where she was born and lived until her marriage, and that not one of the buildings is to be parted with. And Old Home will remain as it is and has been. It has been known far and wide as the Hamlin place practically as long as Rochester itself, the mansion and many of the other buildings dating back to the early part of the last century." The Birches lived at the Hamlin place full-time after Judge Birch retired. He died in 1921 and Belle died in 1936, at which time the property passed out of the Hamlin family ownership for the first time in 100 years. And with the death of Belle Hamlin Birch, the last flesh and blood descendant of John Hamlin in Rochester passed from the scene. Although, as I mentioned, he did have grandchildren from his daughter Carolyn Duesenberg, who were living elsewhere. Now I'd like to backtrack just for a moment to the death of John Hamlin himself in 1863. At the time of his death, his daughters Belle and Laura were still minors at age 17 and 14 respectively. And John's will made an appropriate provision for them by naming a guardian for their financial affairs. And John chose for this role a man of similar stature in Rochester by the name of Lysander Woodward. So that will serve as our segue to our other family. And we turn our attention to the north end of the village of Rochester, where we find the lands of Lysander Woodward. Among those Western New Yorkers who arrived in Oakland in 1838 was a 21-year-old Lysander Woodward. He had been born in Columbia, Toland County, Connecticut in 1817, but he had moved to New York with his parents in 1825 to the town of Chiley in Monroe County. Chiley is the red star on the map, and the blue or purple star down there is East Bloomfield, New York. I wanted you to see how close these two locations were. Lysander Woodward was the son of Zale Woodward and Harriet House, and both of his parents had long roots back to colonial days in Connecticut. So let's crack open the Woodward genealogy just a little bit. Lysander is descended from a line of Woodwards that traces back to an immigrant named Henry Woodward, who came to the Massachusetts Bay County from Liverpool in 1635. Henry Woodward had 4 children, 3 daughters who were given the Puritan names of Freedom, Experience, and Thankful, and a son named John. Now, Lysander, of course, descends from the son John. But John's sister, Experience Woodward, married a guy named Medad Pomeroy, and if you follow the descendants of Experience and Medad down through the generations, you will eventually run into their great-great-great-great-grandson. And some of you in this room are carrying his picture on your person. Yes, President Roosevelt is a direct descendant in the line of Henry Woodward, as is our own Lysander Woodward. They're cousins. Now, that's a descendant of Henry Woodward through his daughter Experience, but if you take a look at the downline of his other daughter, Freedom Woodward, and you follow her 14 generations forward, you run into these two guys. Their Royal Highnesses William and George, the current heirs to the throne of England. They are direct descendants of Henry Woodward and his daughter Freedom Woodward through the family line of their mother and grandmother Diana Spencer. Now back to Lysander's parents. Zale and Harriet Woodward had 10 children. We're lacking the birth dates of some of them, so I'm not sure the exact birth order of the family. But judging from the ones that we do know and the date of their marriage, we can deduce that Lysander Woodward is one of the younger siblings in his family. And he was not the only one to make the trip to Michigan. His sister Fanny Loomis came to Michigan also. She was the wife of Henry Worthington, who was a prominent farmer in Livingston County. And there is some evidence that Lysander's brothers, Henry and Nelson, may also have come from Michigan to New York. Lysander himself arrived in 1838, 3 years after Avon Township was organized. The population of the township was about 1,630 people at that time. And it was here that he met and married Penina Axford Simpson, who was a descendant of the Swayze family that settled in Salem, Massachusetts in 1629. Penina Simpson was born in Tompkins County, New York, and that's slightly to the southeast of Monroe County, so she was in the same general area of western New York. And it appears that she came to Michigan with her mother and some of her siblings after her father died in 1841. So Lysander and Penina were married in Oakland County in May of 1843. And in the following February, a little more than a year before their first child would be born, Lysander Woodward bought an 80-acre parcel north of the village of Rochester for $1,100. That was $13.75 an acre. And in terms of today's relative currency, that's about a $500,000 real estate deal for somebody who was still looking forward to his 27th birthday. By 1847, he had doubled his holdings to 160 acres, and by the mid-1950s, he would own more than 350 acres, effectively everything that we think of as the north end of the village of Rochester today. On the original 80-acre parcel, bought in 1844, Lysander and Penina built their marital home. This is the earliest image that we have of it. It's from the 1877 Durant History of Oakland County. And this is how an artist depicted the house and the grounds and the Woodwards themselves. This also happens to be the only image of Lysander Woodward that we have. There are several of his wife in later years, but the only one we have of him. From a statement that Lysander provided to the State Agricultural Society, we know that in 1866 his farm produced $3,800 in total sales, including $1,444 for wheat, which was his money crop. He had a flock of about 300 sheep. It was upon this farmstead that Lysander and Penina Woodward reared their family of 3 daughters and 2 sons. The first was Harriet Arabella, who was named for Lysander's mother. She was born in 1845, died unmarried in 1893. She spent her entire life at the Woodward farm and took care of her mother after the death of her father. The second child was Emma Catherine, who was named for Penina's mother. She was born in 1847. She married a prominent Detroit architect named John Scott, about whom we'll hear more in a few minutes. The third child was Robert Simpson Woodward, named for his mother's father and born in 1849. And I'll have a few words about him in a moment also. The fourth child was Hubert, born in 1853, who married Clara French and had 1 child named for his own father, Milton Lysander Woodward. And the fifth and last child was Eva, born in 1855. Eva married Arthur Sheldon Parker, who was a Detroit pharmacist, president of the Detroit Drug Company, and a representative of Parke Davis. And I haven't found any information on this yet, but I often wonder how much influence Arthur Parker had in Parke Davis locating their biological farm here in Avon Township. While Lysander Woodward was establishing his farm and bringing up his family, he was also interested in politics and public service. He served as supervisor of Avon Township in 1856. He served in the Michigan House of Representatives from the 1st District of Oakland County. And he also served a couple of terms as Oakland County Treasurer. He was Justice of the Peace of Avon at various times, which is why the newspaper sometimes refers to him as Justice Woodward or the Honorable Lysander Woodward. When he got through being the county treasurer in 1870, he started a new initiative that is his most important contribution to the Rochester community. He began to advocate for the construction of a railroad from Detroit to Bay City, with the goal of having the railroad line run through the village of Rochester. Because at this time there were no railroads serving the village. Recall that the one that John Hamlins started never went anywhere. And of course the Clinton-Kalamazoo Canal didn't get past here. Clinton River was not navigable to Rochester. And so the village's only connection to the outside world was by horse and wagon over plank roads or by stage. Like John Hamlin before him, Lysander Woodward saw the difference that a railroad line would make to Rochester's fortunes and to his own, as access to the railroad line would open up city markets to his agricultural products. So he and others invested in the Detroit and Bay City Railroad Company, and after placing his own money on the line, he went on the road as a sort of evangelist for the railroad. He attended public meetings in towns all up and down the prospective route,
urging the citizens and property owners to get on board, so to speak, with their money and with their support so that the line could be built. And his efforts were rewarded. The railroad became a reality in 1871, and the tracks reached his own home of Rochester in 1872. In recognition of his organization and financial skills, he was elected the first president of the DNBC. A Detroit architect and civil engineer by the name of John Scott was hired by the railroad to do the survey and engineering work for the line, and while he was at it, he apparently did a little surveying of the railroad president's daughter, because in 1874, Emma Woodward and John Scott were married. The Scotts lived in Detroit, where John had his architectural firm, and John did residential, commercial, and ecclesiastical architecture, and there are still plenty of examples of his work around Michigan. His probably most well-known building is the old Wayne County building, the 1902 Wayne County building on Randolph Street. And his residence, his personal residence that he built for himself and Emma, is in the East Ferry section down on Wayne State University. It's part of the inn at East Ferry, so you can actually go down and stay in that house. Both of these places are on the National Register, by the way. And we have a couple of John Scott houses, John Scott designed houses in the city of Rochester. A little aside about Lysander's architect's son-in-law is this story, which by some historians is considered to be apocryphal, but whether it is wholly true or not, it is pretty amusing. It is a matter of fact that John Scott hired a young apprentice draftsman to work in his architecture firm in Detroit. It is also a fact that he fired the said apprentice not too long after hiring him. The disputed part of the story is Scott's reason for firing the apprentice. According to the architectural historian W. Hawkins Ferry and others, John Scott fired his apprentice because he felt the young man lacked an aptitude for architecture. The apprentice's name was Albert Kahn, and the Kahn biographers dispute that. So I don't know if it's true or not, but it's a funny story. Now back to our railroad. We have an eyewitness account of what it was like on the day that the long-awaited railroad arrived in Rochester. And the eyewitness account comes to us not from the Woodwards, but from the Hamlin family. Just shortly before her death, at the age of 79 in September of 1872, Olive Hamlin Burbank gave a series of interviews to Fidelia Woolley Gillette, who was a Universalist minister here in Rochester, and by the way, the first woman to be ordained in the Universalist Church. Mrs. Gillette wanted to write Olive Burbank's biography because she was one of the pioneers. And so she sat down with her and did a series of interviews which were transcribed. This is probably the oldest existing oral history that we have in our community. So as Fidelia Gillette tells it, this is what Olive Hamlin Burbank had to say about the day the railroad came to town. And I'm quoting now. On the 24th of August, 1872, there sounded through Olive Burbank's house a strange, unknown cry, the voice of one of her children calling, "Mother, Father, the locomotive will soon be here." And then this aged couple hurried out with their children, and sitting side by side in the pleasant yard, kept watch amid the ringing of bells and the roar of cannon, the shouts of the rejoicing villagers, for the first train of cars on the Detroit and Bay City Railroad. Down the hill and beyond the creek, slowly, slowly up the glen, and on the border of what was once to have been the great raging canal, slowly along the valley and between the hills, came the new engine, drawing after it the construction train. Slowly, slowly, slowly over the new track and the yet unballasted road, where once this aged pair had seen only the unbroken forest with its Indian trail. And now at the last, Olive Burbank knew that the home of her adoption, dear to her heart for 50 years, was linked to the great surging outside world with its rails of iron and its wires of steel." End quote. So it was a really big deal. Not just for the Woodwards who had built it, but for the Hamlins. John Hamlin was dead by this time, but his sister Olive fully realized the importance of what had just happened. With his children grown, the railroad built, and his farm and community prospering, Lysander Woodward turned to politics again in 1878. At this point, he had been a staunch Republican all of his life, but he was now drawn into the new National Greenback Party. The Greenback Party was given birth by the Panic of 1873, an economic downturn which had caused a foreclosure crisis among the farmers of the rural America. It was a grassroots movement. It was organized in club meetings at the county level, and it attracted many farmers who felt that their fortunes had been undermined when unfair banking practices had ushered in the panic. Many disaffected Republicans, such as Lysander Woodward, and also some Democrats, joined the Greenback ranks, and the Greenbackers strongly advocated the agrarian cause. They called themselves a reform party, were characterized by their opponents as a protest party, and were criticized for their potential to damage the Republican ticket in the election of 1878. Any of this sound familiar? Michigan was a fairly strong Greenback state, and the party managed to assemble a viable state ticket at its convention in Grand Rapids in the summer of 1878, so they nominated Lysander Woodward for the office of Lieutenant Governor of Michigan. The outcome was that the Republican ticket was elected by a very healthy margin with 45% of the votes cast. The Democrats got about 28% and the Greenbackers 26%. That's statewide. In Avon Township, the results were different. The Democrat gubernatorial candidate Orlando Barnes carried the day in Avon, while the lieutenant governor race was a nearly three-way tie, with Rochester's own Lysander Woodward winning his home township by 2 votes. In his 63rd year, in 1880, Lysander Woodward contracted tuberculosis, and that disease, which was complicated by the asthma that he had suffered with all of his life, took his life in January of 1880. He died in his home on North Main Street with his family at his side, and the community turned out in great numbers to mourn his loss. We know this because the Rochester Clarion described the event in great detail. And here's what the newspaper said, quoting now: "The house was not only crowded, but many who could not get in gathered upon the outside, all anxious to pay their last respects to the honored dead. A beautiful casket with plate glass sides and top, and lined with white satin, contained all that remained of our respected townsman. The cortege following the remains to the grave was nearly half a mile in length, and every manifestation of sorrow was expressed upon all sides as it slowly moved to our beautiful cemetery, where all that was mortal of Lysander Woodward was tenderly laid to rest." End quote. Remember, the funeral took place in the middle of January, so the weather was like it is now. And that half-mile-long funeral procession that was just described would have comprised people on foot or in horse and buggy, traveling the distance from Tinkin and Rochester to Mount Avon Cemetery slowly in the cold. And not only that, a lot of them had to stand outside during the funeral because they couldn't get into the house. So try to imagine that scene. It is clear from that description in the newspaper that Lysander Woodward was held in great esteem by the people of Rochester. Now, following Lysander's death, the children sold the family farmstead to their cousin Ludovic Cole. He was the son of Penina Woodward's sister, Mary Simpson Cole, and the sale was made on the provision that Penina Woodward would hold a life estate. She continued to live in the house until her own death in 1894, and at that point, her children bought the farm back from Ludovic Cole. And then sons Robert and Hubert sold their interest in the property to their surviving sisters, Emma Scott and Eva Parker. Both the daughters and their husbands made permanent homes in the city of Detroit by this time, but they used the Woodward family farm as their summer or weekend getaway. We have a couple of photos of the adult children and their spouses available to us, and this one is taken in the summer house on the property before Penina died. So from left to right, we have Emma Woodward Scott, and then seated in front of her is Arthur Parker, and then Eva Woodward Parker, Harriet Woodward, Penina Simpson, and the guy on the right is Robert Simpson Woodward. We know from the Durant image and one other image of the house that the house was redone sometime between 1895 and 1915. We think most likely 1898. And a colonial overlay was placed on the front of the house, which extended the porch along the entire east side and put the wide exposure siding on there. The assumption is that because John Scott was either managing or living at the house at this time, he's probably responsible for the design changes to the house. Now, setting aside for a moment Lysander Woodward and John Scott, who we've already talked about, the most famous person associated with this house on a national level is Lysander and Penina's middle child, Robert Simpson Woodward. He earned an engineering degree from the University of Michigan, and he went on to a long and varied career in government service, academia, and publishing. He worked for the U.S. Lake Survey, the U.S. Transit of Venus Commission, the U.S. Geological Survey, and then he took a professorship at Columbia University, and he taught there for a decade. Then he took up the job as the president of the Carnegie Institution of Washington, and so he moved to D.C. At the same time, he was serving as the associate editor of the journal Science. He was married to Martha Gretton Bond, and the couple had 3 sons. And if you remember, about the same time that Robert Simpson Woodward was living in D.C. and running the Carnegie Institution, Marsden Birch was living in D.C. and serving as assistant to the U.S. Attorney General. So I think it's probably likely that these 2 Rochester power couples crossed paths in Washington, D.C. Robert Simpson Woodward died in Washington, D.C. in 1924, and he is buried in Rock Creek Cemetery there. As none of the Woodward daughters had any children, all of the Woodward descendants come from Robert and Hubert. Hubert and his wife had 1 son, Milton Lysander Woodward, and Milton had a daughter, and so there are a few living descendants from that line. Robert here had 3 sons, and there are a number of living descendants from Robert's sons, although to my knowledge none of them has ever lived even in Michigan, let alone in the Rochester area. They're in New Hampshire and other places all over the country. Eva Woodward Parker was the last surviving child of Lysander Woodward when she died in 1933. And her will accomplished a couple of interesting things. First of all, she left a substantial bequest for the support of her housekeeper, Mary Louise Welters. Mary had been in the employ of the Parkers for 28 years, and Eva's will provided that her estate should be used to support Mary Welters for the rest of her life. And this was greeted as somewhat significant at the time because Mary Welters was an African-American woman, and in a still racially divided America, this was not an everyday type of occurrence. It was considered noteworthy enough that the gift was written up in the periodical The Crisis, which is the official publication of the NAACP. But after the death of Mary Welters, the residue of Eva Woodward Parker's estate was directed to be used to fund the construction of a new public library building for Rochester. And that building was constructed in 1950-51 at the corner of what was West 5th and Pine Street, now West University. And it was known as the Woodward Memorial Library. It was designed by William E. Capp, who was also the architect of Meadowbrook Hall. The library was located there from 1951 until 1992, when it moved to the building that we're in right now. But the old library building still carries the plaque on the southwest corner reminding us of the Woodward legacy. And the Rochester Hills Public Library also commemorates Eva Woodward Parker's gift each year when the staff places flowers on her grave at Mount Avon Cemetery. Now, some parallels between these two families. Their footprints are all over the place and their names are all over the place. We know that they both came from New York State, although independently of one another. And they were situated like bookends at either end of the village. Up at the north, we had Lysander Woodward's house on North Main Street, and at the south end of town, we had John Hamlin's house on South Rochester Road. And these were prominent houses. Their farms were large. They both subdivided their farms eventually. Both of these men were involved in transportation infrastructure. They were interested in roads and railroads. They both had powerful children who lived in Washington, D.C. And they both have schools, elementary schools named after them. As you can see right here, we have Hamlins School and Woodward School. We have streets and roads that bear their names. We have Hamlin Road, we have Woodward Street, we have Lysander Street to remind us of these families. Both of these men held office in our community in similar roles. They were supervisors of Avon Township, they were justice of the peace, and so on. Here are the subdivisions. We have the Woodward addition on the north side of Rochester, and then we also have Woodward Heights. And then we have the Hamlin Place Farms at the corner of Hamlin and Rochester Roads. So if you live in either one of these areas, you see these family names on your tax bills. And as I mentioned a minute ago, we have the Woodward Memorial Library. This is the plaque that's on the old library building that reminds us of the gift of Eva Woodward Parker. You have to kind of look under the trees and shrubbery that's in front of the building now, but it is definitely still there. So this is a cultural institution in our community that's connected to the Woodward family, and I thought, okay, what is the equivalent parallel in the Hamlin family? I don't know what that would be unless maybe you think this qualifies. And that's just a little bit of a joke, but really, this is another way that the family name is perpetuated in our community. And this is right about where the toll house would have been on the old plank road. So it's a good place for the traveler to stop in and rest. So summing it up, although these families came independently of one another, and there is no evidence of any particular influence in common that brought them here other than the quest for westward expansion, once they got here, their lives followed remarkably similar paths, and their stories are important enough in our local history that their names have endured through almost 2 centuries after their arrival here. And that is my presentation. If you have any comments or questions, I'd be happy to answer.
Is there any connection between Woodward and Detroit and this Woodward family?
June's question is there a connection between Woodward and Detroit and this Woodward family? According to something that Lysander Woodward told a newspaper at some point during his life, Judge Woodward of Detroit was a cousin of his of some kind. I haven't been able to find that. Lysander's family line, going back to Henry Woodward, the immigrant of 1640, is very well documented in a number of places. The line of Augustus Woodward, who's the Judge Woodward of Detroit, for whom Woodward Avenue and everything is named, is also fairly easy to find, although his name, in case you didn't know that, was not Augustus. He made that up. He thought it sounded more judicial than his real first name, which was Elias. So when you're looking for his ancestors, you have to follow the line of Elias Woodward, and I followed them both back a long way, and I can't find a common ancestor, so I don't know. I can't imagine that Lysander Woodward just pulled that out of a hat, so there's probably something back there that I just haven't found yet. Yes, sir.
We talked about plank roads. Are those actually wood roads going out of Detroit? Or
The question was whether the plank roads were actually wood roads, and yes, they were. The stringers were laid down and the planks were put down, and that was what you traveled on. There's a great exhibit in the Michigan Historical Museum in Lansing. If you want to know what it was like to ride in a wagon that goes over a plank road, they actually have a hands-on exhibit for that. I don't think it was pleasant. I think it was a real kidney buster. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you.